Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and it's Wednesday, December 22nd, 2021. And today we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the past 7 days. We'll get to those three questions in just a moment, but first want to give a shout out to those watching live here on Facebook every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Always a pleasure to be getting your instant feedback to our answers on these three important questions. To those watching on repeat, either on our YouTube channel for SMIE Consulting or our Facebook page, thanks for making us a part of your journey each week. And of course, those that download the audio-only podcast to hear what our thoughts on these three important questions each week. So let's get right to this week's Midweek Roundup questions. First up, what do veterans and agents have in common in international education? Second, how important is post-study work to international students? And finally, where are up-and-coming markets for international students that the U.S. needs to pay attention to? So we'll tackle those three questions and more in this week's Midweek Roundup. Question number one, what do veterans and agents, educational agents, have in common when it comes to international education? Well, in most ordinary years, you would say not a thing. There are a few campuses around the country, including one of my university clients, where you have a director over military affairs and international students. Those are rare in terms of where they exist in our field, particularly in the United States. But where they have had overlap over the past few months, particularly since the passage of the Thrive Act earlier in the late summer, which had an interesting line in it that prohibited institutions that are working with commission-based agents from receiving Department of Defense Veteran Affairs funding. So this caused a great deal of consternation when it first came out in both military affairs units on campus as well as international education units on campuses that were already using agents, educational agents, as part of their international student recruitment strategies. It was put in place largely to reflect, I think, some domestic trends that have been in place and are still in place that prohibit commission-based recruitment of for staff and salaried positions on campus for recruitment of individual students to university campus. That's been in place legally for domestic recruitment forever. However, international student recruitment has always been, or certainly has been seen in the United States as something that's increasingly accepted as a part of international student recruitment efforts by universities to pay commission to agents who recruit students for your university, where you pay a set price or a percentage of the tuition fee for each student that is recruited by a particular agent. So that's happening out in the wide world and has been for a number of years. And certainly since NACAC in the early 2010s put together their commission to review the state of affairs related to international student recruitment, and they decided not to prohibit it as part of their code of ethics, which language had been in there previously that prohibited commission-based payments. But now that's been removed, and frankly, now we're seeing over half, or just about half, of U.S. colleges and universities that recruit international students are using educational agents, commission-based educational agents, as part of their strategy, some using it exclusively. So the conflict has come in with this Thrive Act that appeared earlier in the summer, late summer, that was seen as an oops mistake by the authors of the bill. And there were a couple of different variations on, or legislative fixes that were proposed in late September, early October. One of those has clearly made it through the process of being reviewed by Congress and eventually getting its approval. That was called the Remote Act, kind of seen as a fix to do that. That passed the U.S. House just about 2 weeks ago now. And then just last week was passed by a voice vote by the U.S. Senate. So that rarely happens on contentious pieces of legislation in the U.S. Congress, and it's usually reserved for proclamations of honoring this day is now honoring a certain person day. Those things are voice votes in the U.S. Senate, certainly where they don't even bother calling the roll, which can take quite a few minutes and can be subject to delays and filibusters in normal circumstances when there are more contentious issues at stake. Here for this remote act as the legislative fix to the Thrive Act, you've seen that passed by voice vote in the U.S. Senate this past week. And just this week, I think it was on Monday, President Biden signed the Remote Act into law, thus correcting the potentially calamitous Thrive Act if it were let to stand, and how that would impact U.S. colleges that are recruiting or relying heavily on agents for their student recruitment. Having just attended the ARC conference, certainly this was an issue that obviously struck at the heart of what ARC is about in terms of setting educational agent standards for ethical standards and kind of certification standards for agents, and they're heavily invested in that, as are the universities that are partnering with ARC. As becoming members of ARC to understand more the issues involved with agents. So the conference had, I think, 50 or 60 agents, some of which are U.S. based, but many of which were overseas, far fewer than they normally have because of travel and restrictions and visas and vaccines and all the wonderful things that have made international travel quite complicated recently. So it's good to see that that has been taken care of. ARC certainly was on it early on when that first came up earlier in the semester, and most international educators weren't getting too worked up about it because it's an obvious mistake in the original legislation, and I think we're seeing now that the overlap here that we see. With veterans and agents regarding universities and colleges that either have veterans that are funded by Department of Defense funds, GI Bill, and all those wonderful things, or are they using educational agents to bring in international students? So that most folks realized it was going to happen, and there was a little bit of brinkmanship going on here, pushing the deadline, pushing the ball as far down the path as possible, with other priorities taking precedent. The Biden administration's Build Back Better agenda and their act that had passed the House and was close to passing the Senate until this past few days. That certainly was taking priority, and now that will probably take center stage again in terms of what that might look like. But this fix happened and finally was approved, and everybody can breathe a sigh of relief, so that in future these hopefully issues will not be intertwined unnecessarily again. But certainly it reflects some growing. Thankfully, there are legislators who were responsive enough to realize, to international education communities and higher ed associations that saw the error right away, and they fixed it within 3-4 months. So legislative process can and does work when need be, and certainly this is a good reflection of that happening. So happy to see that take place. Certainly a sigh of relief amongst institutions and certainly educational agents that are working with U.S. institutions, because certainly if U.S. institutions had to choose, this would be a very interesting debate if it ever were to happen. Given the fact that we're talking here about institutions that might receive substantial numbers of international students from overseas through educational agents, and also receive a significant number of veterans that attend their institutions, or domestic students living in their area that want to come to their schools, and the benefits, the federal government money that comes to them as a result. The similar parallel that does affect international education and government money in the United States that we've seen over the last 2-3 years has certainly been with Confucius Institutes. Those institutions in the United States that had been hosting Confucius Institutes, one of the main factors that they have, aside from all the politics, but one of the public factors in terms of why they are cutting their ties with Confucius Institutes or closing their doors to them, is so that they can receive Defense Department funding for language training. So that by law was prohibited that if you were working with or had a Confucius Institute receiving money from the Chinese government for language instruction, Mandarin instruction as a result of having the Confucius Institute, then you would not be able to receive these Department of Defense funding for similar language training. So that's the only other time I've seen that kind of duality going on with dual purposes, where bottom line dollars coming from the federal government made the decisions for a lot of institutions. So that in this case with agents and agents, or veterans and agents, we're talking about a situation where probably U.S. institutions, if they would have to have chosen between agents and veteran-sourced money, you would think that priorities at their institutions, domestic concerns would indicate that the veteran money would have been more important to the overall institutional health and reputation. So it'd be interesting to see which way some campuses would have gone, particularly those that maybe don't have a high veteran population but rely heavily on agent-driven international student population. That could have been a very contentious issue on a lot of campuses. So which way they would have gone with it. So in terms of what this story means, it's probably one and only time we'll talk about this on the Roundup. We've mentioned the Thrive Act before and the necessary corrections that were needed. Certainly in our newsletter, we've been tracking that coverage for months, and certainly have been reporting on the successes this week by passing the House, the Senate, and then receiving President Biden's signature this week. We've been reporting on that, but this is probably the only time we'll cover it during the Roundup. But it's an interesting intersection in higher education where you see competing interests that actually come to agreement on something that was clearly an error in the initial act, the Thrive Act. So let's move on to question number 2. How important is post-study work to international students? This is the question that I think more and more you are finding universal agreement in the international education community that having post-study work is almost a prerequisite for international students to consider coming to your institution. Not every country, not every student is driven by the opportunity for post-study work because they're always planning to come home and run the family business, or they know they're going on for further graduate study, and once they have that degree, then they'll worry about it. But for that initial student that is looking to come to, maybe they're coming for an advanced degree, maybe they're in a field that they know that they can get employment fairly easily once they've graduated. The attraction of post-study work is essential in certain markets, and it's important in others. Universally, I would say that international students, on the whole, not overgeneralizing here, but on the whole, this is one of the most important issues. And we keep seeing this popping when we see a lot of surveys. Intl survey recently had information about that we reported on this past week, that career outcomes are up to near the top of the list for parents and students these days, and a lot of that may be driven by pandemic impact on economies in all across the world, but in certain families they've become increasingly price sensitive too, in terms of maybe they don't have nearly as much to spend on their son or daughter's education. So they have to be more selective in terms of where they go. So we're at a point now where I think, and it's not just the United States where this is an issue, because you see major destination markets. Certainly we've seen Canada jump forward to the head of the line in terms of having the most open and friendly and easy transitions from study to work, and actually smooth, clear pathways that are used to recruit students. And they've taken full advantage of that. In terms of their countries and institutions in their country, attempts to bring international students and attract international students. And when it comes to India, that's Canada's number one market. India is probably the most post-study work-driven market out there. And we'll talk a little bit about that in one of our stories here. But we're sharing this question, the answer to this question, as it is an essential piece of a student's journey to finding that institution that's going to be right for them. Again, not every student, but for the lion's share of students where you're going to be interacting with in your student recruitment journeys, if they're not openly thinking about it or expressing it to you, it's on the backs of their minds, and certainly on the minds of their parents who are paying the bills, because the parents now want to know, what are the likely outcomes for my son or daughter when they've graduated with a degree from your institution, in terms of either going on to graduate school right away, where are the kind of institutions that they can get into, what percentage go on to grad school, or more directly, what are the work opportunities, how many get jobs in their field within 6 months of graduation. Those are the kind of things, the data that you need to have in your back pocket that you can readily turn to. And yes, at most schools, if you have that data, it's largely going to be universal for all graduates, not necessarily specific to international students. The universities that do have that data for international students, that post-study work opportunities in terms of what percentage are getting jobs right after graduation, that's the kind of data that you actually do have at your fingertips. If you work with your international student scholar services offices, you have access to OPT. It's going to require data that's in SEVIS. You are able to find that data, employment data, because the students are having to enter that now. But it does require some digging. It's not just one button you can click to get a full report of every place that your international students that are still on your books have jobs. But it's an exercise certainly worth doing. In terms of giving yourself a fighting chance to have answers to questions that your prospective students and their parents are going to ask you about work. If you have that content ready to go, ideally you have the data that can say, hey, on the whole, international students, our graduates in general, will get 90% will get jobs within 6 months of graduation for those that are looking for jobs. We know that 30% of our graduates go on to graduate school right away or further study, whatever it might be. Having that data is probably step one most important. Step two is having those anecdotal stories, having those success stories, those alumni success stories that can show, hey, these international students got jobs in their field. Here's what they're doing now. So get some that are a year out, get some that are 2 years out, get those alumni success stories 10 years out. That can share through quotes, through video, through chats that they're willing to host for prospective international students. Those are the kinds of touch points where if you can add those into your recruitment strategy, if you can have that data readily available for responding to direct questions, but also embedding that in messaging out to your prospective audiences. Those are the kinds of nuggets that go well beyond just how you talk about your institution as whatever language you're using as a safe, secure, academically challenging, financially affordable institution. Those are all great and important themes that help describe your university, but also have in your back pocket, have in your comp plan, those kinds of stories that relate to outcomes, that can talk about the data, that can talk about the successful alumni stories, that have those anecdotal quotes that you can put in from your international graduates about how they've gotten jobs and what those jobs have led to, and how their time at your institution prepared them for those jobs. All of that is just recruitment gold, and even basically basic currency you need to have to be successful long term in recruiting international students, and particularly post-pandemic. I don't think we're out of it yet, but certainly as this pandemic carries on and the impacts of it are felt more broadly around the world, you will see increasingly students and parents focusing on outcomes. So make sure if you don't have that information now, make sure you've put in motion the kinds of things that can help you gather the information, help you get those anecdotal stories that can help put together a strategy for you that can help use those successes, your data, in recruiting the future students. Because this is all part of what we've been talking about with SMIE consulting for the last 2 years, is the importance of focusing on the entire international student journey. And not just from prospect to enrolling on your campus, but from prospect till they're alumni. And connecting the dots all the way through that process and having the kind of touch points not only about affordability on the front end, safety on the front end, academic rigor on the front end, but then getting into campus community once they're enrolled, and all the ongoing orientation things you need to be doing and informing students of throughout their time on campus. Tying together the relationships with the key offices on campus that they're going to be working with academic advising, with housing, with student affairs, career services, alumni offices. Connect all of those dots together. Paint that picture of that entire international student journey, and have clear and concise transitions from one to the next throughout their time on campus, either before they get here to the time they leave your campus. You want to have that complete story, and post-study work is going to be a very important piece of that puzzle that your future students and parents will want to know about. And certainly your current students are eagerly anticipating what their next steps will be when they're done. And having that data, having those success stories, connecting them to to graduates that can help them understand not only what their experiences can lead to, but also future networks of colleagues and for other graduates of your institution that they can be plugging into, because that's an important piece. Make those connections all the way through, because that's the value add that you have at your institutions that you can leverage. Most admissions offices aren't doing that because that's not their function, but it certainly should be the function of whoever has SIO responsibility to be thinking about how this whole journey works and how all the pieces fit together on your campus specifically. So the post-study work piece, make sure that's an important part of your recruitment strategy because it matters. It's not just all the fun stuff on the front end and how much fun they're going to have once they're on your campus. It's the parents asking, what's my son or daughter going to be doing when they graduate from your institution? Show me some examples. Give me the data. So make the attempts now to start gathering that, and we can walk you through that if you have questions about that. So that's it for question number 2. Let's get to our final question of the day, and that is, where are the student markets that are growing in terms of interest for the United States? And this is something that I think is absolutely essential for us as international educators in the United States to always be on the lookout. And I bring this up for a number of reasons, because colleagues I meet at conferences who are pinging me for ideas on where they need to be spending some time if they're looking for new markets to explore. I say you got to have some data that backs this up. For me, there's a lot of survey data out there. There are obviously lead gen sources that are also providing other pieces of the enrollment puzzle as well throughout the funnel. One of those, IDP Connect. In Truth in Advertising, I write articles for IDP Connect on a series of topics throughout the year. We've done topics on new markets before. We've talked about Vietnam. We've talked about other countries like that, and Brazil and a couple others. But IDP Connect, they have some great data for students that are using their various search tools, search platforms, hot courses, IDP own student search platform that are tracking basically those that are looking to go to English-speaking destination markets. And they have specific data for every country, but you have to be a member of either you signed up for IDP Connect services for the lead gen sources. They give you you can get access to what they call their IQ tracker, IQ demand tracker. They have some fantastic data, which I think is beyond just student survey data, because it's real-time data on what students are searching for, destination countries, academic programs in terms of level of interest. And I think that helps U.S. institutions get a perspective on where students are looking for throughout the world by having access to this kind of data, because again, it's all about your perspective. If you think that international students are only looking at the United States and not other countries, you're missing the point of why students look abroad for study. They're not just looking at the U.S. anymore. For many years, they've been looking at a variety of other countries. Certainly, Australia, the UK have been traditionally our top two countries that we're competing against for students. But you've seen Canada come up. You've seen China rise as an English-speaking destination because of the huge number of programs, over 3,000 English language programs that they've had their institutions build specifically to attract international students to campus, to their country. And the majority of international students that go to China are not going there to learn Mandarin. That's kind of an added benefit. They're going to study in English. And that's something that we miss that trick here in the U.S. Certainly, they've suffered quite a bit during the pandemic because they've been closed doors to everybody outside of NYU Shanghai students and maybe some Duke Kunshan students, so that have been able to get back into the country. Otherwise, they've been closed doors to returning and new international students that have all had to do their education online if they wanted to participate in Chinese higher education. So for a U.S. market, it's important to know we're in a global race for these international students. And the IDP folks have a tracker that they use, and they present some core data that shows this kind of athletes in a race in different colors for different countries, and they show where your country is in comparison to the rest. And it's interesting how, certainly in the wake of the Trump administration, the U.S. has been at the back of the pack for a lot of the things that international students are looking for, in terms of how they rate different countries. So what this IDP tracker data looks at, and what it does reveal, this article that I'm sharing focuses on 3 countries: Turkey, Thailand, and Indonesia. They all are ones that have in years past been in the top 20 sending countries to the United States. I think most of them still are. But what they're tracking through IDP, again, these are students that are using IDP sites, either Hot Courses or IDP's own platform, that cover, I think, between 20 and 30 million students a year are using these services. So it's not there aren't huge swaths of, in terms of the students that are on these platforms, again, aren't just coming to the U.S., they're going to Australia, UK, Canada, wherever it might be. And they're not necessarily always the exact, like if you look at U.S. students, or international students in the United States, where they're coming from, it's not going to be exactly the same proportions. Like it's not half Chinese or 34% Chinese as the current Open Doors data shares, and 20% Indian. It's not like that. But certainly in terms of where the percentages are, India is certainly a lot higher, China is a lot lower. But for the student, if you are using IDP Connect, Hot Courses, whatever, as part of your lead gen strategy in terms of the students that are using their platforms, you should be focusing on 3 up and coming countries: Turkey, Indonesia, and Thailand. In addition to India and Brazil, which have traditionally in the last 3 or 4 years have been at the top of IDP's data charts in terms of the numbers of students that they have coming through. The IDP, India and Brazil have traditionally been at the top of those charts in terms of interest in the United States. They have also, but Turkey, Indonesia, and Thailand have been coming up, certainly up and down, but certainly within the top 4 to 5 countries of student volume that are using IDP's Connect services to search for U.S. institutions. So this is important in terms of just getting a sense of where the up and coming demand is. So outside of India, Brazil, by looking at Turkey, Indonesia, and Thailand, this article goes into a lot of the reasons why and places, and they focus actually, interestingly, for Turkey, when you look at top cities in the world in terms of where student interest is, looking at the United States, the number one, again, because based on the IDP numbers in terms of where their students are, they don't have huge numbers from China. But outside of, for IDP's numbers, you're looking at Istanbul as the city with the most concentrated interest in the United States. So if Turkey is on your radar, focus your efforts on Istanbul, then on Ankara, then on Izmir, in terms of the three cities there. They do a similar look at other countries in Indonesia and Thailand. You see similarly, Indonesia, Jakarta, obviously the capital, is going to have the lion's share, 29% of all Indonesian cities that are looking at U.S. higher ed options. And then you look at Thailand. Bangkok actually ranks second from the top, indicating significant interest from Thailand in the United States in terms of the demand there. So 55% of the Thai market that's U.S. focused is in Bangkok, with Chiang Mai is just under 5%. So that's the rest is scattered around the country. So this is some important data that I think they focus on, and it's important. And they go into majors that are most interested. Students in those majors, in those cities, what majors that they're looking for. That you'll hear that information in this article. So some really good stuff there. They also say some other emerging markets that are focusing on the U.S. are Mexico, Vietnam, and Colombia, each in the top 10 on the IDP numbers for demand for U.S. education. So definitely recommend checking these out. There's some great data here. Always need to have that data to justify why you want to do recruitment in certain areas. This will certainly help get you some of that. So hopefully this gives you some insight onto the student markets that are growing from some of this IDP data. But hopefully you get a better sense today through all these issues as to what some areas we might need to be focusing more on in our international student recruitment efforts. So until next week, which we will be having our last roundup of the 2021, we'll have a retrospective look at the past year and everything that's happened in international education, pandemic impacted and otherwise. We'll take a retrospective look at 2021, as everybody likes to do at the end of each year. And we'll be up fresh again in the new year in early January with our first roundup of 2022. So until next time, we wish you all the very best and have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Cheers.